I'm the Deputy Director of the James Wilson Institute. We're delighted to join our friends at the National Review Institute in hosting you for what should be a real treat. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. That's how Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee eulogized George Washington. Our speaker tonight, he needs no reminder of the source of that quotation, though. That's because Richard Brookhiser might be described as first in popularizing the American founding for a wide modern audience. Through his 13 books on figures such as Washington, Lincoln, Marshall, Madison, and Gouverneur Morris, just to name a few, he has educated a generation of readers on the remarkable Americans who shaped our regime of law and liberty. Richard was born in Rochester, New York. After earning a bachelor's from Yale, he started at National Review, where he's stayed ever since. He's been a regular columnist, and he's also a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. While at National Review, he also became a historian of the founding period. He said, after writing about modern politicians, it didn't seem a stretch to write about dead ones. The founders are our fathers. They're also our contemporaries, present in so much of what we think and do. He's also written and starred in a series of documentary films on the founding period, some of them produced by our friend Michael Pack, which aired on PBS. Richard's upcoming documentary, set for release toward the end of 2020, will build off his previous book on John Marshall. It is somewhat appropriate then that we host this evening's event at the DACOR Bacon House, where in the early 1830s, as Michael said, Marshall lived. Richard's newest book, Give Me Liberty, A History of America's Exceptional Idea, tells the story of how, quote, 13 liberty documents define America as the country that it is, different from all others. The book is a tour through 4 centuries, from Jamestown to the fall of the Berlin Wall, by way of those documents. Despite the book's latest document being from 1987, the book is a noteworthy contribution to the contemporary discussion that's occurring on the right about whether liberty is a good in and of itself, and if not so, what are the rightful ends to which liberty ought be ordered. We'll dive into that subject and several others in our discussion and Q&A, but now it's my great pleasure to welcome Richard Brookhiser.
Why stand we here idle? What do gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and of slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course other men may take, but as for me, give me liberty, give me death. Patrick Henry, March 1775, Richmond. He was addressing an illegal meeting of the Virginia House of Burgesses, which had been dismissed by the colonial governor, but continued to meet as the Virginia Convention. And the topic before them in March was unrest in the fellow colony of Massachusetts, occupied by a British army since 1769, and about to break out in violence at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Americans were talking about liberty, they were thinking about it, they were getting ready to fight and die for it. But this was not the beginning. They had been doing this for over 150 years, and they would continue to do it for more than 200 years afterwards. Liberty is the characteristic of this country. It is the characteristic of our nationalism. It is our exceptional idea. And to make this case, I wrote a book about 13 episodes, each one producing a document. I'll just survey what they are. The first, number 1, 1619, the minutes of the first meeting of the General Assembly at Jamestown. Number 2, 1657, the Flushing Remonstrance. Number 3, 1735, the record of the trial of John Peter Zenger. Number 4, 1776, Declaration of Independence. Number 5, 1785, the the Constitution of the New York Manumission Society. Number 6, the Constitution, 1787, ratified a year later. Number 7, the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. Number 8, the Declaration of Sentiments of the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. Number 9, Gettysburg Address, 1863. 10, The New Colossus, poem by Emma Lazarus, 1883, written to raise money for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, which would be erected in 1886. Number 11, Cross a Gold Speech, 1896. Number 12, FDR's Fireside Chat on the Arsenal of Democracy, 1940. And number 13, Ronald Reagan's Tear Down This Wall speech, 1987. Now, some of these documents you've read many times. Others are obscure. Some of them are long, some of them are short. The record of the Zenger trial is 13,000 words. The Gettysburg Address took 2 or 3 minutes to say. The New Colossus is 14 lines. Many of them are eloquent. Some of them are a mixed bag. Many of them are signed by famous people. 3 of the faces on Mount Rushmore. Others are signed by people who are otherwise unknown to history, except that at a certain moment they stepped up and put their signature to one or other of these documents. Some of them explain a right for the first time or a liberty for the first time. Others talk about liberty in general. Some of them plug gaps in our experience of liberty. They repair shortfalls. And 3 of them deal with foreign affairs, which may be a little surprising because this is a book about American nationalism, but they're in there because the world is always close. It always has been. And often it's been hostile, problematic. So liberty elsewhere has often been a concern of us. So tonight what I want to do is talk about 2 of them, and then we'll have our discussion and our Q&A. The first one I want to talk about is, I think, the most obscure. I've only met one person who'd heard of it. That was Jack Fowler at National Review. He actually wrote about it. And that's the Flushing Remonstrance. I think the reason that's obscure is because it not only precedes the United States, but it didn't occur in British North America. It happened in New Amsterdam, a Dutch colony. And because of the Dutch nature and the Dutch surroundings, it's faded a bit from our mental map of our prehistory. But the Dutch bought Manhattan Island in 1624, and 30 years later, the Director General of the colony was a man named Peter Stuyvesant. Where I live in Manhattan, I can look out my window at Stuyvesant Park, which is a fragment of what used to be his farm. And in Stuyvesant Park, he has a statue. It's one of the better public statues in New York. It shows him standing with his right hand on a staff that's almost as tall as he is. One of his legs is a peg leg. He lost the leg in one of Holland's colonial wars against Spain. And he looks just like what he was: alert, intelligent, and not a man you ever want to cross. He was not unlike Rudy Giuliani, another effective governor of New York, mayor of New York. Stuyvesant's particular craziness was bigotry. His father was a Dutch Reform minister, and Stuyvesant believed that only Calvinism was the route to heaven. So when he became Director General of New Amsterdam, he began persecuting the Lutherans and Jews who lived there. And he did this until he was yanked on his chain by his employers, the Dutch West India Company. New Amsterdam was a commercial colony. And the men who employed Stuyvesant had investors and directors who were Lutheran and Jewish. So they told him he couldn't do this anymore. And a good company man, he stopped. Then a third religion appeared in his colony, and this was Quakers. In the mid-17th century, Quakers were a new religion, and they were countercultural. Quakers would not use different forms of address when speaking to their superiors. They would not take their hats off in the presence of their superiors because they didn't believe there were superiors or inferiors. They let women preach equally with men at their meetings because they thought all men and women were equally open to the inner light of revelation. The first Quakers to come to New Amsterdam are a ship captained by a man named Robert Fowler. And when he appeared before Peter Stuyvesant, Stuyvesant told him to keep sailing, keep going up Long Island Sound. You'll hit Rhode Island. They're more hospitable to oddballs, so leave my colony. He left behind two women, Dorothy Waugh and Mary Weatherhead, who began preaching in the streets that the end of the world was nigh. Everyone must listen to them. He had them escorted out of the colony. Then a fourth Quaker shows up, Robert Jackson. He begins preaching in the streets. Because he's a man, he is arrested, and Stuyvesant has him whipped in public and in private. And he whips him so hard and so long that he gets an anonymous letter from one of his subjects saying, "You're going to kill this man if you keep this up. Wouldn't it be better to let him go?" So Stuyvesant expels him. And then he announces a policy. No more Quakers in New Amsterdam. Any ship that brings them will be fined. Anyone who harbors them in his house will be penalized. And at the end of 1657, he gets a remonstrance, a formal protest from 30 men in the village of Flushing. Now, Flushing is still there. It's part of what's now Queens, the borough of Queens. That's where Donald Trump grew up. But then it was an independent, self-standing village. And this letter was written by the town clerk, a man named Edward Hart. It was signed by 3 other town officials and 26 ordinary men. And the remonstrance told Stuyvesant that they could not agree with this directive. And their reason was that we would do unto others as we would have all men do unto us. For this is the true law of church and state. Thus saith our Savior and the prophets. I think what's impressive, 2 things are impressive about this document. One is the source of the reasoning. We're taught that religious liberty in America is a product of the Enlightenment, a project of men like John Locke and men who read philosophers like Locke, men like Thomas Jefferson. And certainly that's a big factor. Another factor that James Madison identified is what we might call sociology. Madison said, we have religious freedom here because there's so many different religions, no one could prevail over all the others, so they all agreed to live together peacefully. And that's also an important factor. But the men of Flushing were telling Stuyvesant that they had to be able to welcome Quakers because their religion told them to. Their argument for religious liberty was based on their faith. The second thing that impressed me about the Flushing Remonstrance is the signatures. 6 of these men were illiterate. They couldn't sign their names. They had to make marks. But they laid down a marker. What Stuyvesant did was he cracked down. He summoned Hart to Manhattan and he grilled him. And we have the record of his interrogation because the Dutch are very good record keepers and their records have survived. And it's what cops have done since the beginning of time. Where did you write this? Did you talk to the other town officials before you wrote it? Who agreed with this? Where was it signed? On and on. And Hart tries to duck away from these questions. He doesn't want to incriminate anyone. But Stuyvesant is relentless and he throws Hart in jail. He arrests the other town officials, throws them in jail too. Some of them stay in jail for as long as a month. And sadly, they all crack. They all recant. Before we judge them, we have to recognize that nothing stood between them and Peter Stuyvesant. The only people who could rein him in were across the Atlantic Ocean in Amsterdam. They were alone against a tyrannical Director General. But this doesn't solve Stuyvesant's Quaker problem. They keep showing up. One man, John Bone, Stuyvesant throws him in jail for 5 months, hoping he would crack. And then he finally decides to send this man to Amsterdam to have his bosses in the Dutch West India Company decide the case. And they write back and they tell Stuyvesant, look, we don't like Quakers any more than you do, but the colony needs settlement. So if they want to come here, let them in. And Stuyvesant accedes to this. Now, soon after that, he loses his job because the British take the colony. In 1664, an English fleet sails into the harbor and demands Stuyvesant's surrender. But the terms of his capitulation, interestingly, guarantee to the inhabitants all the liberties they have hitherto exercised, including the liberty of conscience, which Stuyvesant himself had fought. And then after Stuyvesant is summoned back to Holland to be chewed out for losing the colony, he chooses to go back to what is now New York and spend the rest of his life and die there. So perhaps he had some second thoughts. The importance of this for America is related to the importance of New York. It becomes the largest city in the country, which it still is. New York State was for many years the largest state. New York has a big megaphone, so its religious practices have a lot of influence. And one of the sources via New York of our religious liberty is the Flushing Remonstrance. The second episode I want to talk about is plugging a gap. The worst gap in our history, of course, was chattel slavery. And that took the deaths of 750,000 men to plug that gap. The figure used to be 620,000. I met the historian who changed it. The old figure was from adding up the death totals from the Union and the Confederate armies, and you got 620,000. But a demographic historian looked at the census records, and he said, you know, we're missing 130,000 men. So the accepted figure is now 750,000. Well, another gap, equally striking, though not as bloody to resolve, was the status of women in America, and particularly the fact that in most places and most times they couldn't vote. Interestingly, women who met the property qualification could vote in New Jersey beginning in 1776. This was probably originally an oversight. The first post-independence New Jersey Constitution got rushed through because the British were invading the state, and instead of speaking of freemen when it came to voting, they spoke of inhabitants. So the women of New Jersey noticed this. Now, the two wrinkles are that, one, there was a property qualification, and second, under the common law of that day, women in marriage did not own any property. All property was owned by husbands. So no married woman could ever meet a property qualification. But if you were a single woman or a widow and you had enough money, you could vote in New Jersey, and they did vote. And there were enough of them that they had a name. They were called the petticoat vote. And election laws in New Jersey would use language like, on election day, the voter will place his or her ballot in such and such a box. And this went on for 31 years. They finally lost the vote in 1807 when New Jersey had a spectacularly corrupt election, even by New Jersey standards. The issue was where the state capital should be, what town should it be in. So real property values were at stake. So people played very hard ball in this election. A lot of towns submitted vote totals that were greater than the number of people who lived there. So in a sort of burst of shame afterwards, they purged the voting rolls by disenfranchising women with property and free blacks. So they were made the scapegoats for this awful corruption. So after 1807, no voting women in the United States. And it begins to change, largely thanks to a woman from upstate New York, her married name would be Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was born in 1815. Her father was a judge who had served a term in Congress. And her husband, Henry Stanton, was an abolitionist politician and orator. And in 1840, Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, Elizabeth and Henry, go to London to attend an international conference on abolition. And one of the issues that roils the conference is whether women in attendance will be allowed to vote. And this is controversial. The motion goes down. Women are not allowed to vote at this meeting. And either there in London or shortly after she got back, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said to one of her friends, "Why can't we have a women's rights convention?" And she held on to this thought for a number of years. She moves, settles finally with her husband in a town called Seneca Falls, which is in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. And in 1848, she's having tea with a number of her woman friends. And they are complaining about their lot in life. Years later, Elizabeth remembered that one of her complaints was the chaos into which everything falls without women's constant superintendence. Now, she's 33 years old. She has 3 sons, 6, 4, and 3, and her husband's on the road. It's an election year. He's politicking. She may also have had a miscarriage that year. It's not clear, but there's some language in letters that might be coded Victorian terms for a miscarriage. We do have a photograph of her about this time, and she looks attractive, smart, and harassed. So she was speaking from her own experience. And then the husband of the hostess of this meeting said to them, "Why don't you do something about it?" So they decided to have a women's rights convention. They had to move quickly because they wanted to take advantage of the presence of Lucretia Mott. She was a Quaker from Philadelphia who was an abolition and temperance orator. She had a national reputation. She was only going to be in upstate New York visiting family for a brief time. So they sent out invitations. They got a hall, a church building in Seneca Falls. And then before the meeting, they were considering what should be our statement. What should be our statement of principle and purpose? And Elizabeth described them thinking and thinking until one of them took up the Declaration of Independence and read the first 2 paragraphs. And they thought, this is how we will begin our statement of purpose. The first 2 paragraphs of the Declaration of Sentiments track Jefferson's language almost exactly. The changes they make are to include women. So they say all men and women are created equal. There are a few other changes of that kind, but the rest of it is pure Jefferson. And the brilliance of that move has to do with who's the oppressor. For Jefferson, the oppressor was the king and Parliament. If the revolution succeeded, they'd be gone. They'd be across the Atlantic. But the oppressors of women are men. They're not going anywhere. But if you quote the Declaration of Independence, you're telling American men, you already agree with us. You're Americans. You don't know it, but you already agree with us. We're just making an extension of something you already hold dear. And then the Declaration of Sentiments, like the Declaration of Independence, goes into a list of particular complaints. Women were not allowed in college. Only Oberlin College at that time accepted women. They were confined to low-paying jobs such as governesses and elementary school teachers. They couldn't be professors, lawyers, doctors. All property in marriage was owned by husbands. And in this list was the fact that women could not vote. And this was controversial even among the women organizing this meeting. The reason it was controversial was that many of them, like Lucretia Mott, were Quakers. And although Quakers believed in activism, in protesting and urging reform, they thought politics was irredeemably corrupt, that voting, office holding, was a swamp that could never be drained. So you were wrong to participate in it. Lucretia Mott told Stanton, "Lizzie, thee will make the convention ridiculous." But Elizabeth Cady Stanton knew differently because her father had been a congressman and her husband was a politician. She knew politics firsthand. She had a ringside seat on it. She knew the importance of it. And she knew that the best guardian of your rights has to be yourself. You can't be virtually represented. You have to be able to cast your vote, to express your opinion, your will, yourself. So when the meeting met, it was a two-day meeting in July, and they actually debated the proposition on whether women should ask for the vote. Stanton spoke in favor of it. Also speaking in favor was Frederick Douglass, who came down from Rochester, New York. He was the former slave who is now an abolitionist editor and orator. He's the only black person we know to have attended the meeting. There are 12 people who signed the Declaration of Sentiments about whom we know nothing, so some of them may have been black. But 100 people signed, 68 women, 32 men. And the statement was noticed in several dozen newspapers. The split was about half and half, pro and anti. One of the pro newspapers was the largest in the country, the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's paper. But it took a long time for the vote to be given to women. And I think the reason is obvious. The struggle against slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction are a vortex which sucks up all reforming energy in addition to a lot of other energies and lives. But in the late 1860s, territories and states in the West begin to allow women at the state or territorial level to vote. New York State allows women to vote in 1917. The next year is an election year. And in 1918, there's still one woman surviving from the Seneca Falls Convention, a woman named Rhoda Palmer. She lived all her life in Geneva, New York. She only ever lived in 2 houses her entire life. She and her father had driven over to Seneca Falls in 1848 in his gig. They drove back. She remembered that on the way home, the gig broke down. They had to spend an extra night on the road. But in 1918, at the age of 102, Rhoda Palmer was driven to the polls in an automobile, and she cast her first vote. So there are 11 other episodes, 11 other stories in the book. I wrote them to bring them to everyone's attention. I wrote them because I want people to enjoy them. They're all interesting, enjoyable. But I want people to be inspired. I want people to be inspired by men and women, many of them ordinary, who stood up at a particular point for the cause of liberty, and sometimes at personal risk. I mean, at the Seneca Falls Convention, the risk was to be mocked. You know, Lizzie will make us ridiculous. For the Flushing Remonstrance, the risk was worse than that. And I also want to remind us that although I think our record on liberty is pretty good, it's 400 years long now, but it's not self-perpetuating. There's nothing automatic about it. It has to be maintained in every generation. So that's the thought I'd leave you with, and Garrett, let's have our discussion. Thank you.
Well, Richard, that was wonderful. Thank you for the overview of your book. For the benefit of our guests, they should know that this is not the first time that you and I have shared an extended conversation about your work. You were kind enough to record a podcast for the James Wilson Institute on your book on Marshall last year. And in a similar vein to the way I asked you how you chose the cases you did from Marshall's corpus for that book, can you talk a little bit about the deliberative and the narrative process you engaged in selecting these 13 documents and weaving them together?
There was some beat poet, I think it was Ferlinghetti, he said first thought, best thought. And I just wrote down 12 documents. And later in the process, I added a 13th. I won't say which one that was. You'll have to guess. Why did I pick the ones I picked? I mean, some are obvious calls, the Declaration, the Constitution, Gettysburg Address. It's less obvious how you say anything new about those documents, but I think I found some, maybe not quite such blazingly obvious things to say. And then the other ones were just based on, years of reading I've done, articles I might have done for American history, or, one of them was influenced by a book I read in college called The Burned Over District, which was a book about upstate New York and how upstate New York in the early 19th century was California. Every wild, weird thing in America was happening in upstate New York. And, some of it pretty out there, some of it very important. So, that was the process.
Yeah, you called these documents at one point snapshots from America's marriage to liberty. Snapshots from the album of America's marriage to liberty. Did they need to flow chronologically, or did that kind of help the themes emerge?
Well, you could have done it thematically. That's another obvious way to do it. I guess I just like chronology. I've written a lot of biographies, so people are born and they do stuff and they die, and that's the story of every biography. So hopefully this is not going to be dying with Reagan stared down this wall speech, but chronology seemed to be the way to go. And I did find, as I was, because I didn't want to just have 13 absolutely, discrete, sealed off chapters. I had to give a little bit of narrative tissue between them. And these documents do refer to each other. There's discussion back and forth among them. The Seneca Falls quoting from the Declaration of Independence is a very obvious one. But, Americans are aware of themselves and of their own history. And you can see that as this topic gets batted around and keeps reappearing in different times and places.
Right. You talk also about how if you had to assemble a B team of documents, it wouldn't be very hard at all. You could probably even assemble a C team. And that speaks to the depth and breadth of the American experience with liberty.
Right. Where's the Mayflower Compact? Where's the I Have a Dream speech? Well, they're there. They're there in the same lineup. So they're in the bullpen. We won't lose them.
You write in your introduction, quote, "The unique feature of America's nationalism is its concern for liberty." And your concern is that the need for telling this story now is what I see around me. This is the most confused historical moment I have lived in, between a haggard establishment, a perverse intelligentsia, and an inchoate populist pushback. America's national essence is being ignored, trampled, or distorted. Those who remember the right words and principles repeat them as platitudes. Others spurn them or offer substitutes, do it yourself or imported from abroad. Because the people offering substitutes are either less intelligent or less virtuous than the authors and the original audiences of the Liberty documents, their alternatives are worse. Whoa, that sounded like quite the marker to put down in a book that probably few would find controversial from its title. But very early on, it seemed like you wanted your readers to understand that this was you looking back because you felt that this moment was crying out for perspective. Am I off base here?
No, that's right. Was 1968 better? No, and I lived through that, and that was worse in a lot of ways. But I felt the pressure of now, and I didn't write this book for conservatives or for the right wing. I think a liberal American could read this book and see where he or she comes from, see what he or she believes in, equally with you or me. But I felt the need to write this because I think the left has been falling down on this topic for a long time. I see the right doing it too, and so I wanted to put this out there.
So how do you define American liberty in the most condensed way that it would kind of be the basis for which you might explain to a foreign citizen, a foreign-born American who is trying to become a citizen?
Well, or to a lot of Americans who let it slip. I think it is liberty of the person. When a nation becomes independent, that's the liberty of the nation. And I think a very common misinterpretation of the Declaration of Independence is that it's just a separation. I won't say who, but an old friend, colleague of mine, he used to say, well, it was Americans saying we're equal to Englishmen or Frenchmen. We can be a nation ourselves. Yes, it is saying that, but it's saying a lot more. And it's saying that our quest for political separation and the right to do that springs from the liberty of us as individuals. Now, it's personal, but it's also plural. I mean, you couldn't imagine a polity in which you were the only free man. I mean, that would just be like a science fiction kind of anomaly. And less anomalous, but still anomalous if there's only 10% are free or only half are free. That chips away at it. My liberty is yours. Ours is theirs. So those are the two things that I would stress about America. Liberty as Americans understand it.
Sure.
Have understood it.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you spent the time that you did on the Flushing Remonstrance, because I think religious liberty is a subject that I think a lot of Americans are sort of coming back to in understanding how architectonic it is towards how we think of liberty in general. Do we think that it's in service of a higher purpose, or is this a good that is contingent? And so,
well, one thing that comes up over and over again is that we don't make these liberties. They're not made by men. I mean, they are for men and women, but we don't make them. Thomas Jefferson did not make them up. The Continental Congress did not make them up. They are ours because of our nature, because of who we are. And the men of Flushing are saying, this is the law of the Savior and the prophets. Thomas Jefferson, I think I said there in some book that he had no more religion than a cat. But he does say this is from the laws of nature and of nature's God. So, whatever Thomas Jefferson's prayer life, he is saying that because liberty is something that cannot be destroyed. It can be removed. People can be oppressed. It can be taken away from them. But their right to it cannot ever be effaced.
Sure. Yeah, it reminds me, one of the quotes from our namesake, James Bolson, is, "We didn't bring forth this Constitution to invent any new rights, but only to secure those rights we already held by nature." I think this was understood by most of the, if not all of the founders as part of the project. So what in your view is so wrong about conservatives who today might be asking, for example, what are our freedoms of speech and religion ordered towards? How does that kind of run into the overall argument that you've been making on a broad-based appeal to liberty?
Well, that's always a good question, but who is going to answer it? And let's have a discussion about it. But I think the people asking the question want a little more than that. They're looking to answer it and compel answers themselves. So in that we should always scratch our heads when people are
or at least
going in that
proceed
direction.
with prudence.
Well, yeah, right.
So on the subject of the Flushing Remonstrance, I, as an American of Dutch background, whose father took him to one too many old cemeteries in Brooklyn and Queens as a boy, may be one of your only interlocutors who was not reading about the Remonstrance for the first time in your book, but I was nevertheless surprised to see it on your list. Does the Flushing Remonstrance seek the kind of negative liberty articulated in the Declaration of Independence for religious practice, or is this maybe a more nuanced appeal based on practicalities that the Dutch settlers were dealing with?
More nuanced in the sense that it asks more of people to do things, or it's
Well,
not?
it seemed to be more of a, because it is practiced in Holland, we as subjects of ultimately the Dutch authority, not Peter Stuyvesant's authority,
Right.
should be treated this way.
Well, okay, that's one of the arguments they make. I mean, they're like good lawyers, even though, well, a couple of them are, but so they've got multiple arguments. You know, and one of them is we have a town charter. You know, the colony was trying to encourage Englishmen to come here, so it was offering town charters with various stipulations. We've got the charter. Also, we have the practice of Holland. They call it the outward law of Holland. But the one that I think really moves them is what they call the inward law. And this is, you know, the law of our Savior and the prophets, which that I think is the sort of the white-hot core of the Remonstrance. And, you know, and I wanted to highlight that not to take liberty away from the philosophers and the sociologists, but to remind them that there is also this even more important justification for it. And that is very related to the concept that we do not make this. This is something that we have because of who and what we are.
Now, as we are the James Wilson Institute, I would be derelict in my duties if I did not ask about the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution, the two documents that our namesake, James Wilson, signed. You write at one point, "The Declaration set liberty, ordained by our Creator and inseparable from our equality in black and white, at the top of our national birth certificate. The Constitution secured equality by forbidding kings and nobles and refusing to acknowledge slavery." And yet, would you agree that that's not quite the complete story? I mean, isn't it necessary to describe fully the aspirational liberty and equality of those two documents with reference to the central importance of the slavery question and the Civil War, and of course, Lincoln's eloquent Gettysburg Address?
Well, sure, and that's why the book goes on. That's why it doesn't stop in 1787, 88. And I sort of made a deliberate writerly decision to hold that question in reserve, because I knew it was going to come up big time. It actually comes up between the two documents in the Constitution of the New York Manumission Society, which is 1785, and involves, you know, some of the players in the earlier and the later national statements. The New York Manumission Society, I put this in there to remind us all that slavery was a national institution. You know, it wasn't just evil Southerners. New York City had more slaves than any city in the United States except Charleston in the late 18th century. A lot of New York's colonial economy depended on the triangle trade, and it still depended heavily on artisans and small farmers, to say nothing of, you know, big landowners having slave labor. So this was something that was in the grit of New York life. And there was this fortuitous post-war alliance of, you know, Quakers, who were always the outliers and the oddballs, but also the elite of the state, who their justification or their reasoning was, we just fought this war for liberty, and we have to extend the project here in our own state. So you have men like George Clinton, who was the governor of the state. You have John Jay, the great revolutionary patriot. You've got Alexander Hamilton, the Army East, you know, coming up formally on George Washington's staff. You've got other Revolutionary War veterans. You've got this odd alliance of people who fought, you know, and Quakers who can never fight because they don't believe in that. But they came together to begin the process of ridding their state of this evil. So yes, I am not, you know, I only go back to the Declaration and the Constitution's relation to the slave question in the Gettysburg Address, because that's what Lincoln does. You know, of course, he starts off referencing the Declaration 7 years ago, and then he ends with the preamble to the Constitution, because it's of the people, by the people, and for the people. And he's picking up on we the people. So, I mean, it's this brilliant act of editorial compression. He's stuffing these two documents into a little 2-minute cemetery talk. But that was just a writer's choice to sort of not tell everything at the same time.
Sure, sure. You have this lovely quote from Lincoln where he says, I love my country partly because it's my country, but mostly because it's free.
Oh, right.
Did I miss that?
No, but he quotes it, and he's quoting from Henry Clay, this is in his eulogy for Clay when Clay dies, and it's this that Lincoln picks out to remember Clay by. And you know, Clay was a complicated man, and he's called the Great Compromiser, and you know, compromise is compromise, and it can be good, and there can be bad aspects to it. But Lincoln believed, and I think he was right, that in Henry Clay's essence, there was this concern for liberty. He did approve of 2 efforts to make Kentucky a free state, 50 years apart, 1799, 1849. They both failed. But he was at least nominally in favor of those, even though he was the largest slaveholder in the state. But that's what Lincoln saw in him, and also Lincoln's a clever man. He wants to use that aspect of Clay and then Clay's whole reputation and sort of hijack them for his own purposes. But that's politics. That's what we do.
Sure. I would like to turn it over to the audience, but I did have one question about 3 documents that you did not discuss in your presentation, but I think were very important for anybody considering reading the book. Just how the scope of your analysis, how far the scope of your analysis extends, and that's in your 3 foreign policy documents, the Monroe Doctrine, the Arsenal of Democracy speech, and the Tear Down This Wall speech. Now, in the foreign policy realm, we often hear that American ideals must be subservient to American interests abroad. Now, you chose 3 examples of when American ideals intersected with American interests. Do you think this fits your narrative a little too neatly, or do you think that the role of the statesman is to be able to, whenever possible, make American ideals intersect with American interests?
Well, I mean, you asked the question so nicely, you gave me my answer there at the second half of it. No, but look, these are important statements. They're all presidential. They all lay down important foreign policy markers. They are both very principled, and they're also prudent. They're not trying to do everything for the whole world. They're trying to address specific threats. Monroe is saying, no more kings in this hemisphere. I mean, we're usually taught the Monroe Doctrine as no more colonization, and that's true. But he also says that the attempt to reimpose Europe's political systems in this hemisphere we would view as hostile. And the specific scheme he was trying to ward off was a French plan to put Bourbon princes on thrones in the newly independent countries of Latin America. So it was and by the way, the French do this during the Civil War. When we're distracted in the Civil War, they take a Habsburg and stick him on the throne of Mexico. So this is not an idle threat. Arsenal of Democracy is no Nazis in Britain. And that's, not only good for Britain, that's vital for us. If they were in Britain, that would be very bad for us. And then Tear Down This Wall speech is no more communists in Central Europe. No more communists as they have been. Mr. Gorbachev, if you're really reforming things, great, but you can prove it by tearing down this wall. And also, these 3 statements were very carefully thought out. I mean, they weren't impulses of the moment. The Monroe Doctrine was really hashed out in the cabinet. The Arsenal of Democracy, FDR had Nazi Germany in his sights for a long time, and the issue of American war preparedness for a long time. Similarly with Reagan, as we all know, and there's that great story by Richard Allen. He goes to Reagan after the 76 failed effort to get the nomination, and Reagan's obviously going to run again. Allen wants to work for him, and Reagan says, well, my plan for the Cold War, some would call it simple-minded. I think it's simple. We win and they lose. How do you like that? But he's telling it as a joke. He's telling it as a joke, but I mean, he's very serious about it and very thoughtful about it. So each of these three statements were carefully considered.
So we have a microphone that is going to be passed around, but I would ask if you could just please wait before receiving the microphone if you have a question, because it will be impossible to pick up your question, and definitely hard for the other half of the room to hear your question if you don't wait for it. So
there's a hand.
Okay,
hand
great.
right there.
We have a hand in the back over here.
In 1992, it was supposed to be a U.S. postage stamp for the Salem witch trials, and it never happened because it's a real blemish on early colonial history, what happened in Salem, Massachusetts. Another thing I'd like to mention is 1797, Joe Barlow had a treaty with Tripoli, which is pretty much forgotten, and yet it's pretty significant. Any comments on that?
Well, it's interesting, the Tripoli Treaty, this was to frustrate jihadist extortion. You know, the Barbary states ran a protection racket. Nominally, it was religion. They waged jihad against non-Muslim shipping. I think their real religion was extortion. That's what they were interested in. If you paid them off, they wouldn't take you ships. So I think it's odd, to say the least, to view a treaty with the mob as a basis for our policy or a statement about our nature. Salem witch trials, yes. I mean, if you're looking for dark pages in American history, you're going to find a lot of them. The heart of man is desperately wicked. Always has been, always will be. What I think we have done net is tried to repair those sins.
Right here.
One minor niggle. Hillsdale College, 1841, accepted women and blacks.
Oh, okay. All right, good. No, good for Hillsdale. I read, I read this in a book on Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but clearly it's wrong. Yes, I think, Hillsdale has this program of building statues on their campus, and, they have Lady Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and a bunch of other ones. But for my money, the most impressive one, and I was never told about this, I just discovered it when I was at Hillsdale and I was walking around, and it's that plinth, I guess it is, which has the names of the Hillsdale students who died in the Civil War. And I thought, what noble young men from south central Michigan, middle of nowhere, but they stood up. And Hillsdale should be most proud of that, of all their statues.
We have gentlemen on the left side of the room.
First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
I look forward to the stories. Could you discuss the contemporary situation? What is our cultural or institutional capacity to write the 14th document, to add to the canon during the 2020s? Is that available to us as a people as you look around as a journalist and writer and scholar?
Oh, I hope so. I'm always a glass half full guy, because otherwise why should I get up in the morning? And I believe good stories beat bad ones, but they have to be told. That's what I've been doing for the last 20 plus years, and arguably longer in my journalism. But it's not going to happen if people don't know what the record is and don't know what the stakes are and what the principles are. So that's why I wrote this book.
Just as a follow-up to that, one of the interesting turns you took in the book was in the Cross of Gold section, where you focused on Bryan's speech, but not on the clinching line.
Right.
You focused on Bryan's speech when he invokes how the worker is actually a businessman
Along with the man who pays his wages.
Yes, and I see a lot more rethinking along those lines within the Republican Party, that if the Republican Party wants to see success in the future, it has to re-envision itself as a workers' party. But to do so, it needs to understand that there's dignity in work, and there's, beyond even the dignity in the work, there's ingenuity that we would normally associate with businessmen and job creators. And there's probably a rethinking along the lines of liberty of occupation, or liberty of professional development and growth, because it just seems like we're living in an era in which you're probably not going to hold the same job for the rest of your life, and everyone needs to have this sort of renewed vision of what it means to be truly in the position of being a free agent.
Well, the reason I included the speech, I had written a piece about the 1896 election for American History, which is my other outlet. I've got a column in it, every issue called Deja Vu. And I try to take something that's happening now and look at a previous time when it or something similar happened. And I was writing about the 1896 election, and when I read the full text of the speech, that sentence leaped out at me. And then I was even more interested to learn that Bryan himself thought the best paragraph in the speech was the paragraph that is the lead sentence of. I mean, not the boffo ending, which brought down the house and which gives the name to the speech. It's interesting that he didn't think that was the best line in it. And he'd been using Cross of Gold, Crown of Thorns in other speeches, but he wrote that sentence in that paragraph the night before. Mm-hmm. That was something he wrote the night before this big performance of his. Now, I'm not for free silver. I think Bryan was wrong about that. He was proposing a solution that wouldn't have solved the problem he was trying to address. And one of the reasons McKinley beats him is that grain prices go up during the campaign because of shortages in other grain-producing nations. I mean, it had nothing to do with the standard of exchange. And McKinley made this point in one of his speeches. He said, free silver will not affect the supply of wheat coming out of India or Russia, or I forget what the third grain-producing country was. But I did think that statement that Bryan got off, I thought that was very important, and it's the best statement of what economic equality can actually mean. Because if you try to define it as an equality of result, you're just going down a rabbit hole.
Right.
A rabbit hole conceptually and probably, politically, and if you really go down, you get very bad results indeed. But this is something, and it's also, I suppose I was also thinking of all the tech gods out there on the West Coast that we're all supposed to think are so cool. Well, yes, they are. I left my smartphone up in the Catskills, and I've been without it for 4 days, and I feel naked. And I'm only living like I lived in 2004 or something. But yes, of course, they're cool. They do a lot for us, but they're not gods. I mean, they are workers, businessmen, just like we are.
I think we have time for a couple more. Hadley.
No, I'll
You defer. Mill?
Yeah, I thought your great talk, by the way, but it ended on sorry, I love your talk, but it ended on a slightly ominous note. You seem to suggest that liberty was under some specific threats today.
It always is.
Yes, could you enumerate what those might be, or suggest how we might address them?
Well, I suggested that in the passage that Garrett read. An elite that's shirked its responsibilities, inchoate populist pushback. That about covers the case. People say, well, what documents happened after 1987? And part of my answer is I'm deliberately not trying to add any, because I don't want to turn any readers away from this book. I dedicated this book to the American people. I meant that. I meant all the American people. I think a liberal Democrat can read this book and get something from it, get something important from it. And I hope they do. You know, I would like to have them do that. So I'm deliberately leaving that indefinite. That's your job. I mean, it's mine too, but it's all our job. Everybody's job.
Hadley?
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on that sober point, concern that you expressed, that whether the current generation would be as responsive to these questions as the first generation, as the Civil War generation was. And there are other questions that are alluded to the same thing. Now, Lincoln, in that famous speech in July 10th, 1858, we're just celebrating the 4th of July. And there are people here who are newcomers, whose families were not here at the time of the Revolution. And yet, they have the sense that this is about them.
Mm-hmm.
That they understand, they look at the doctrine, all men are created equal, they own that no man is by nature the rightful governor of others in the way that God is by nature the rule of men. Men are by nature the rulers of dogs and horses. And if they understand that, he said, they are blood of the blood, flesh of the flesh of the men who made the revolution. That is what Harry Joffre called a kind of democratic transubstantiation. They're connected. They're connected. Then you look at James McPherson's book on the Civil War soldiers. What interesting letters they wrote from both sides. But he puts them on the same plane. All he can say is, you've got to respect them both because they were willing to die for their beliefs. Well, in those letters for the Civil War soldiers, they understood the principle. Mm-hmm. Lincoln's lines were running through. They said, in giving freedom to the slave, we're securing freedom to the slave, to the free. These, our fathers died for this freedom. These people want to take it away. And what you see is this historicism, the relativism, that is running through the professions. You can't respect these Civil War soldiers by understanding them as they understood themselves. Now they just believe they're willing to die for it. They're willing to die for many things, but we no longer are quite convinced that those original principles are true. And I took your sober point very seriously, Rick. I thought, are we really sure people would understand these things as those two generations did, and would respond in the same way?
Well,
have a separate revolution.
I'm doing the best I can. And I don't mean that as a wise-ass answer. I'm doing the best I can. And Lincoln, as you know, was very worried. He was very worried precisely about what you're talking about, that America was falling away from it. He was particularly worried that his old pal Stephen Douglas was helping to lead this turn away. You know, it's not just opportunism that he takes Douglas on. I mean, he thinks Douglas is really pointing out a very bad way for not the slaveholding South, but for the North to go, which is to not care about it. You know, and so Lincoln's task, his life task, is to defeat this man and defeat what he stands for. So that always has to keep being done. That has to keep being done. And my little bit is just to write this, and hopefully, who knows, there's a Lincoln out there who may read that. I hope so. And you never know. Here, I'll end with this. And I came across this when I was doing my Lincoln book. Someone sent it to me. It was a cartoon from, I think, the 30s. Single panel cartoon. And it was called Hardin County, 1809. And there are these two hillbillies in the snow. You know, they've got like, you know, sort of deer jackets and raccoon hats and whatnot. And one of them is saying, what news from town, Esri? And the man who's on the horse says, well, Squire Weston has gone to Washington to see Madison swore in. And that Napoleon has conquered Spain. What news from here? Nothing. Nothing at all, except a new baby to Tom Lincoln's. Nothing ever happens here. You don't know where your help will come from. You don't know.
Well, Rick, as they said in Shakespeare in Love, that was whoa, 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 wonderful.
Thank you very much.